what we're going to do in this lesson is have a look at how equity is developed through land law. Okay, we're going to look at the sort of history behind this kind of system and why it developed specifically, looking at the deficiencies of the common law. And then we're going to look at a number of different types of areas of land law where equity can intervene to provide some remediation effectively. Now, it should be noted that every single area of equitable development in land law that we're going to look at in this lesson, we're going to cover in a series of lessons when we get to those specific chapters. So we'll talk briefly about, for example, covenants and mortgages and stuff, for example, but these are obviously going to be covered in detail when we start looking at the law of mortgages. So don't feel like you have to understand all of this content right now just from this lesson. We will go into more detail in later lessons. This is just a more of a preliminary introduction to equity in land law. So as we've already mentioned, in the early years of the English legal system, as it developed, it became clear that in some cases the common law was unable to settle disputes. Let me just move this here like so. There we go. Oopsie daisy. There we go. Just moving wires and stuff. There we go. So it was unable to allow for the settlement of disputes between particular interests and particular individuals. For example, the holders of land and also interests in land. People who have interest in lands and people who are holders of estates. So let's have a look at how equity developed to try and come in to try and provide some kind of remedy for these inadequacies. So the first question really is, why were the courts unable to settle these disputes? Okay, because these disputes were unable to be settled in a number of cases. And there are a number of reasons for this. For one, the common law procedure was often too complex, so it was often incredibly complicated, the procedure to bring about a claim when it comes to the delegation of land. The common law would also fail to recognise the rights of individuals in relation to land in a just and fair manner. So there was often a sense of injustice. There was a sense of injustice when it comes to land law. Moreover, as well, not just the enforcement of interests in land, but also the enforcement of remedies were often inadequate at a common law level. So remedies were often inadequate, and we're going to look at remedies in the next lesson. And so, because of all of these factors, these inadequacies began to build up. There was generally a desire for justice and fairness within this system, and that's where equity would develop to try and bring about this just and fair settlement of disputes. One example of this we can look at is the idea of a beneficial interest under a trust. We know, if you are somebody who has studied trusts already, trusts are an invention of equity, or an invention from equity, effectively, we should say. Many would argue that a trust is equity's greatest invention. And at the common law, recognition was only given recognition of an interest. Okay, recognition of an interest. Recognition of an interest was only given to the legal title holder of a particular property. However, in some cases this was seen as unjust. There was some cases where it was recognised that in some cases the interests that are not of the legal title holder may still be valid interests. Therefore, equity would recognise that property may be legally held for the benefit of another. And this was done by way of being done through a trust. So you can hold property in a trust for another individual. And with a trust, the beneficiary will hold the true beneficial rights to use the land, to use and enjoy, to use and effectively enjoy the land. And that's what this system would do. So the beneficiary of a trust is, well, the individual who would benefit from the trust, and they would have the right to be able to use and enjoy the land, even if they are not officially the legal title holder of a particular property. And like I said, when we look at the development of trusts when it comes to land law, the relationship that land law has with the law of trusts, we will look at the concept of beneficial interests in more detail. There is also the equitable right to redeem. So in a system where a mortgager fails to redeem a mortgage loan within a specific contractually obligated time frame, within the specifically contractually obligated time frame, like that, okay, it was often the case that they would lose their property. So if you have a mortgage loan and you don't make payment within the time specified in the contract for whatever reason that might be, you might lose access and the right to that property. As an addition to this, okay, the ownership of the property would transfer to the mortgagee, the person who is granting the mortgage upon the mortgagor, the person who is receiving, receiving the mortgage. However, again, sensing that this is a system that this can be unjust, sensing that it can be unjust, equity would step in and allow a mortgagor to redeem the mortgage even if this time period has passed. And again, when we look at mortgages, we will examine this in a lot more detail. These are just preliminary examples of how equity can intervene within land law to provide more equitable and just solutions to common law deficiencies. Another example, there are two more examples, is the example of a restrictive covenant. So at the common law level, okay, the common law does not allow for what is known as the burden of the covenant, to pass to a successor in the title of the land burdened by that covenant. Okay? And this is just simply because the successor is not party to the original contract. So this is a contractual issue. So this is a contractual issue. And again, with this being potentially unjust, okay, because there could be examples where a successor who is not party to a contract may benefit from some kind of burden of a covenant. Because this is this is seen as unjust, equity again steps in to provide an answer, and it allows for the creation of what we call restrictive covenants. And this is effectively where the burden of the covenants are potentially enforceable against successors entitled to the burdened land. And again, like I've already mentioned in the previous two examples, we will, if you don't understand this, okay, because I haven't gone into it in sufficient detail, we will go over this when we start looking at these examples in a lot more detail. So more in a later lesson. So the final example that I want to touch on is the idea of an estate contract. So at the common law level, where a person enters into some kind of contract to grant another an estate over a piece of land, that's the first point, okay. And where this piece of land, there is a failure to transfer this piece of land, okay, the grantee is entitled to a remedy only by way of a breach of contract. So effectively, in a situation where a contractual obligation is created, whereby you are granting an estate over a piece of land, and you breach that contract by failure to transfer, the grantee, the person who is receiving the estate at the common law level is only entitled to simple breach of contract remedies. Simple breach of contract remedies. So remedies for breach of contract. And when we talk about breach of contract, when we look at contract law, we will discuss this in more detail. Now, like we've already mentioned, this is just a simple common breach of contract remedy that would apply to any kind of contractual obligation relating to the transfer of property, any kind of property, whether it be land or someone's pen or a laptop or whatever. However, it was recognised that land, as we mentioned in the first lesson on land law, land is a unique kind of property. There is a number of different reasons why land is different to any other kind of just simple property law. And so therefore equity steps in again. And equity can provide a remedy of what we call a remedy of specific performance. And this effectively means the grantee, the person who is receiving the estate, is entitled to interests in land at the time of the contract. So even if in a common law level, as we've already mentioned, if we have a common law example, an agreement is made, okay, but the interests are not granted, or effectively interests are not granted until the land is transferred. However, if it's failed to transfer, then that can lead to a breach of contract at a common law level. However, with equity, equity recognises that you should be allowed to be entitled to interest in that land at the time of the contract being signed, the agreement being made, and this is what is known as an estate contract. So in the next lesson, we are going to look at not just the development of equity in land law. We're going to go a little bit deeper and look at not just equitable interests in land law, but also equitable remedies in land law. The kind of remedies that were shown to to try and fill in the gaps of an otherwise deficient common law system.